Morning, everyone. Today is 12 February, the year 2004. I'm Dr. Dave Thompson, a volunteer at the Palm Springs Air Museum here in California. Part of our mission is to record and preserve the history of World War II. As part of the Veterans History Project of the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., we conduct interviews of veterans and civilians who participated in our country's military conflicts. Today I'm here at the museum along with fellow volunteers John Miller, Richard Zuber, Bonnie Kreco, and special guest Betty Smith. Today we have the honor and privilege of interviewing Captain Richard M. Spider Smith.
Richard L. Spider.
Richard L. Spider Smith. Captain Smith was a B-17 pilot and a P-51 pilot during World War II. So we're going to talk to him about that and a lot of other things. So nice to have you here, Spider. John's going to want you to spell your full name for us, please.
Okay.
Yeah, if you'll just give us your full name and birth date, and then we'll take right off from there.
My name is Richard Leo Smith. I was born on the 3rd of June, 1924 in Rochester, New York.
Tell us, Richard, a little bit about your ancestors, where they came from and where they settled, what they did.
Well, my father was from a Smith family who had immigrated from England, and the first ones of his family settled in New Jersey, but then they moved up to, they bought farmland around Penn, New York, and my grandfather, my father's father was a photographer had a photography business in Penn Yan, and he sold this business in 1888 for $8,000, and he was a friend of George Eastman's, and George Eastman told him, if you invest that $8,000 with us, you'll be a millionaire by the turn of the century. My grandfather said, nobody can ever prove to me that you can make film on plastic. You got to use glass plates. So he took his $8,000 and went to Green Mountain Falls, Colorado on a gold rush. And that's where my father was born in 1893.
What a story.
And then on my other side, my mother was raised on the White Earth Indian Reservation in Minnesota, and her father was a half-breed Chippewa, and he became a professional baseball player. He played for the Brooklyn Dodgers and was on the first baseball strike in 1889. He's buried in the cemetery at the White Earth Indian Reservation in Minnesota. He's a Chippewa Indian.
I know where that is.
So I was born in Rochester, New York, and I started. My father built me a model of the Spirit of St. Louis when I was about 8 years old, and I played with that. And after that, I began building model airplanes, and I built my first flying model in about 1935, and I started flying model airplanes, and I collected all the airplane magazines I could get. You know, when the war started, in December I graduated from high school in June of 1942, and the war had already started, and I went down and enlisted in aviation cadets, and they had just taken the requirement for college off of it, and if you could pass a test, you could get in. So I took the test for aviation cadets, and I got called up 3 days later by the captain who ran the thing, and he said, we think you cheated on this test because you got the first perfect score that's ever been gotten on this test, and we want to know who told you the answers. And I said, nobody. I just have read everything about airplanes that I could since I was a little kid. And he said, well, I'll believe you. He says, good luck. And so I went into aviation cadets.
Let me back up just a moment there. Who gave you your first airplane ride?
I was a kid in Rochester, and I went out and looked had some airplanes at Rochester Airport, and there was a beautiful red Waco UPF-7 airplane, the biplane with 2 cockpits in it, and I was looking at the airplane, and the young fella that owned it come up and said, "If you wash and wax this airplane, I will take you for a ride." And so I found out after this that he was the son of the Lindsay family from the Sibley, Lindsay and Kerr company, who ran a big department store in Rochester. And he had washed out of aviation cadets in 1936, and his family, because he was so broken-hearted, bought him this Waco.
Oh, that's kind of nice.
Anyway, I waxed the airplane. He took me for a ride, and I found out why he washed out of aviation cadets. Because he stalled the airplane out at about 30 feet and walked the rudders down to almost a crash landing. Scared the daylights out of me, but I knew why he washed out of aviation cadets. I went on and flew some more while I got about a half a year of college before I went in, was called up for aviation cadets, and I went flying several times then in Cubs and the like. The first Cub I went to fly in was during the winter time, and it had skis on it, and the guy was taxiing out, and he had to stop and wait for somebody to land, and the airplane froze to the ground. So he left me in the back seat, and he got out and rocked the wings back and forth to break the skis free from the ice. And he says, "You get it rolling a little bit, and don't stop. I'll run and catch up and get in the cockpit." So that's how I went on my first ride in an airplane.
I've got to ask you, you're probably in college, but I have to ask you your impressions of December 7th, 1941, what you were doing and what you remember about it.
I got up Sunday morning and was going to go down to the soda fountain where we used to chase girls, and the news come over the radio that they had attacked Pearl Harbor. I wanted to go right and join the service, but my father said, "No, I wasn't even 18 then." And he says, "No, you're not going to go in until after you're 18." So I graduated from high school in the following June of '42, and I was 18 just before I graduated from high school. And then I went on I guess I took the cadet examination about November or December, and that's when I got the perfect score on the test. So I made it into aviation cadets.
Okay, I'm going to let Richard Zuber here, who's sitting beside me, who's been through this training program, classification center, and basic and primary and all the way, and I'll let Richard ask a few questions and guide you through this. Richard?
Thank you. Spider, what airplanes did you fly in flying school?
Well, I went into aviation cadets. A very interesting story. I was taken from Rochester, New York to Atlantic City, New Jersey, and went to basic training in Atlantic City, New Jersey, where we had to march on the boardwalks, and it was in the middle of the winter time, and it was frozen, and we used to fall down every time somebody said right turn, because there was so much ice on the boardwalks. Anyway, from there I went to Penn State College Training Detachment, and I got a good score again, and I only stayed there 6 weeks. And then I went to Nashville, Tennessee. An interesting thing about when I took my physical for my aviation cadets, I was 6'3" and I weighed 147 pounds. And
That's why he called him Spider.
so they said to me, "You got to take a recheck on your weight. You're 8 pounds underweight. You're supposed to weigh 155 for 6'3". So I went to my doctor and I asked him, "How can I gain 8 pounds in a week?" He said, "I don't know how you could do that, but I've heard of people eating that many bananas." So I went and I bought 8 pounds of bananas, and I got up at 5 o'clock in the morning, I ate 28 bananas, and got on a bus and went down and retook the physical. I walked into the place and the guy said, "Here, I need a recheck on your urinalysis. Pee in here for me." And I said, "I'm sorry, I'm going to piss bananas You better weigh me first. So anyway, he weighed me first and I made it. I passed the test.
Wow.
So anyway, when I got to Nashville, Tennessee, after college training detachment, I went through my physical again and I weighed 147 again. The doctor said, how the hell did you ever get here? And I said, well, I ate 28 bananas in the same morning and I gained 8 pounds. He said, what do you want to fly? And I said, P-38s or B-26s. He says, good. And he crosses out the 147 route down 155 and he says, good luck. So that's how I got into aviation cadets.
Isn't that interesting?
I went to Maxwell Field for pre-flight. Then from Maxwell Field, I went to Union City, Tennessee, and I flew the PT-23, which was a PT-19 with a radial engine. They ran out of Ranger engines, and they couldn't make PT-19s anymore, so they made it with a radial engine, and I flew primary in that airplane. And then I went to Newport, Arkansas, and flew BT-13s, the multi-vibrator, and then when I graduated from there, I went to Blytheville, Arkansas, and we flew Curtiss AT-9s, which was supposed to be training for P-38s and B-26s. We even had gunnery training in it because we had a 30 caliber machine gun in the nose of the airplane, and we did air-to-ground gunnery and also aerial gunnery in the airplane. And I figured, boy, we're going to really have it made. The airplane was a very dangerous airplane if you got it too slow on a glide. We lost 20 cadets out of our class. We had 300, almost 350. Anyway, 320 graduated. They took the top 20 and sent them to training in Catalinas for air sea rescue. And the 300 left, they divided in half and they sent half of us as B-24 pilots and the other half, the lucky ones like me, we went to B-17s. And I went to B-17 training and then to Ardmore, Oklahoma, and joined a crew, and we picked up an airplane at Kearney, Nebraska, and we flew it across the Atlantic Ocean, and we landed at, where's the golf course in England? We were supposed to land there anyway. We couldn't land there because it was fogged in. We flew back and landed at Nuts Corner, Ireland, and the first night we were there, we got in a bar fight because somebody insulted my bombardier. They said his father was nothing but a gangster, so he started a fight with the guy because he was an Irishman too, and it was a typical Irish pub fight. And anyway, next day we flew the airplane over to the depot in England, and then we were assigned to the 303rd Bomb Group at Molesworth, and the airplane that we flew across came to our base and became Lucky Linda. It had a painting of Linda Darnell on the nose. You remember who Linda Darnell was? And we flew quite a few missions in that airplane.
Let's take a look at that B-17 on the screen there. It's not the same one, but I think, what is this, a G model?
This is a G model. It's got the tail, it has a chin turret, and I felt it was a great airplane because it got me through 35 missions, and a couple of them we were shot up quite bad. I told Dick about the fact that we were on the mission that Keith Ferris painted the painting of, it was Wiesbaden, the 15th of August 1944. We bombed Wiesbaden, and we lost 12 airplanes out of our group. I was in the lead of the low squadron on that mission, and Thunderbird was leading the mission, and you got a copy of the painting in the museum here. We got a 20 millimeter blew a big hole in the, well, first off, I'll tell you, I thought we were getting shot at by flak because I was flying co-pilot and looked out my right window, and I thought I saw flak that was way far away, and I said, boy, those guys can't shoot at all. And then the tail gunner said, we're being attacked from the rear by an FW-190, and it was his 20 millimeters going off over the wing. One of them hit in the flap just behind number 3 engine and blew a big, about a 3-foot square bulge in the wing and the flap. And then we started losing power on the engine and we feathered it. We went on in and dropped the bombs, made it back to England. We got, in fact, my bombardier got a probable on shooting down that that FW-190. It went through the formation because he was a pretty good gunner. Anyway, that night we were in the officers club and they said over the public address system with the Nafius crew, Nafius was the name of my first pilot, said, would you please come to the lobby, your crew chief is here. So we went into the lobby and he was there and he said, well, I found out why the engine quit. I dug this out of the number 3 supercharger and it was a 20 millimeter shell. It had gone, he said it had gone all the way through the number 3 main tank and stopped in the number 3 supercharger. So he says, here's why you're still alive. And he pours like this and the shell was full of sand instead of powder. It had never gone off. Some slave laborer had filled that shell with sand, which was, we found out later, which was a way some of the guys, the people who were slave laborers were trying to help us. They used to carry the sand in their pockets and fill the shells that they were supposed to fill with powder, they'd fill them with sand.
Oh my gosh.
So,
He never knew he saved your life that way.
Sure did, because I was sitting right next to that tank. If that had gone off in that tank, I'd have been not be talking to you today. Anyway, that's how I got to fly the B-17, and I flew 35 missions. I think we went almost 5 days out of a week to Munich to bomb the BMW engine plant where they were making engines for the jets. They had found out that the jet engines were being manufactured there. So but this was, you know, I think I flew my first mission on the 24th of June 1944, and I finished my last mission on the 25th of October 44. And that's 35 missions in that small amount of time. So I didn't have many passes to London or anything in that time. We flew almost sometimes 4 days in a row. And these were 8, 9, sometimes 10-hour missions.
Wow.
We went to Bruges, Czechoslovakia one time. We flew all the way up over the North Sea, down east of Berlin, and down into Czechoslovakia. And after we got home, they told us the reason for this mission is we were trying to draw up the German Air Force so our fighters could shoot more of them down. But it also meant that we were getting shot at.
You were a decoy.
So anyway, after I finished my 35th mission, I was waiting to go home in the BOQ, and the squadron commander come in, and he said, you know, you said you always wanted to fly fighters. And he said, I got an opportunity for you. They've formed a new outfit called the Scouting Forces. We have one in every division, and the first Scouting Force, which is I was in the 1st Division, and he says, they're interviewing lead pilots. I was a lead pilot by that time. So I went to up to Chelveston, flew up there, and got interviewed by Colonel Bud Peasley, who was the guy that invented the Scouting Forces. And Jimmy Doolittle mentions him in his book. I think I never could be so lucky again, or something that he wrote a great book. Jimmy Doolittle did. Anyway, the Scouting Forces is mentioned in there. So I got accepted by the Scouting Force, and then you want me to continue, or you want to ask more questions?
Sure, you had an extraordinary opportunity there that many of us didn't.
I know.
So you go on and talk about the F-51, please.
Well, I got to Honington in England, which was the base that the Scouting Force was at. It was where the 374th Fighter Group was, and they were flying. They had been a P-38 outfit, and then they changed over to P-51s. And I got trained at this base. My training consisted of about 6 hours in a British Harvard, which was a British AT-6. And the strange thing about the airplane, like the Spitfire, it had a hoop on the top of the stick with the gunnery switches and everything on this hoop. If you look at the Spitfire, you'll find that there's a hoop on the top of the stick. Well, my first flight in that airplane, I almost twisted it off because I thought it was a wheel that you turned to steer like you did the B-17. Anyway, I got up and down in the airplane, and I got my 6 hours in, and then Colonel Peasley asked me to fly him over to see General Doolittle. And I flew him over to you remember the name of the base?
Yes, High Wycombe.
High Wycombe. I flew him over to High Wycombe, and he got out of the airplane. He says, take this airplane and fly back to your bomber base, and be sure you give him a good buzz job. This is the kind of a guy Peasley was. And we used to call him Uncle Bud. And he always wore fancy clothes and a white scarf, and he was a leader on one of the Schweinfurt missions when he was a B-17 group commander, and that's where he got the idea to start the scouting forces, because they had so much trouble with bad weather and stuff going into the target. Anyway, I went back to my bomber group and buzzed the field and everything, like he said, and went back to pick him up, and I flew him back to Huntington, and right after we landed, he said, you're a good pilot. He says, tomorrow we're going to check you out in a P-51. Well, when I got out of the airplane, I walked back, but I don't think my feet touched the ground. I was so excited, you know. And they gave me a blindfold cockpit check in a P-51B, which had a birdcage canopy on it. And I was 6'3", and I had to scooch down like this to close the canopy, and my head was right tight against the top. But I taxied out and went through my whole check and everything, and you had to wind in 8 degrees of right rudder trim when you took off in a P-51, because the torque was so tremendous that you would ground loop to the left if you didn't. Well, I did all of the right things, and I took off in the airplane, but I think I got to 4,000 feet before I ever got the gear up, because I was so busy trying to fly that airplane right. Well,
Let's take a look at that. It's right behind the 17 there.
Yes, there's the great airplane. I flew around for a couple hours doing stalls and all the maneuvers I knew I needed to land, and I put the gear down, and I made the best landing I ever made in an airplane with that airplane. As far as I was concerned, they couldn't have done a better job of designing an airplane than they did a P-51, because it had a nice wide landing gear. It landed beautifully with full flaps down. You kept it about 120 miles an hour on the final approach, and when you leveled out, it slowed down to about 75 or 80 miles an hour, and then it would stall onto the ground, and just I did a grease job on my first landing.
Had they put the Merlin engine in by that time?
The airplane was a failure with the Allison. The Allison, in fact, Tony LeVere, I met him when I worked at Northrop on the B-2, and I met Tony LeVere. He gave a lecture once, and he said the only reason that there was 2 engines in the P-38 is because they were Allisons. That's the only way they could be sure to get home, is if they had 2 engines. That's what he thought of the Allison engine. But the P-51 was made by the Rolls-Royce Merlin. It was a great engine.
Somebody came up with a great idea to change those engines, didn't
Well, the P-51 was designed for the British.
they? Was it?
Yes, they gave a contract to North American to design them a fighter to help them in the Battle of Britain.
Oh.
And they delivered 100 of them to them, and they were a failure because of the Allison engine. And all they used them for was ground attacks and stuff over into France. And they finally put them all in a big yard, and then somebody got the idea to try a Merlin in it, and then it made the airplane. Because the Merlin had 1,200 horsepower, and the Rolls-Royce, or the Merlin had 1,500 horsepower, and the Allison had 1,200 horsepower. And besides that, the supercharger was no good on the Allison, and above 20,000 feet, they were no good. I've flown a P-51 at 35,000 feet. And that's pretty high for a single-engine fighter.
Spider, tell us about the new fuel that they were working with.
We ran some tests. In fact, this is how I happened to have to bail out. Is they decided that they were going to try. They had trouble with the 100 octane fuel because of the tetraethyl lead that was in the fuel. After about 16 or 17 hours, the spark plugs would start to grow together with lead, and then after a while they'd short across and no longer spark. So the guys were losing engines because of the lead in the fuel. So they decided to make an 120 grade fuel instead of a 100 grade fuel, and they put ethylene bromide in the fuel, which was a scavenging agent for non-ferrous metals. It was supposed to get rid of this lead on the spark plug. Well, it did. It got rid of the lead on the spark plugs, the bronze bearings, the aluminum piston tops. The engines lasted an average of about 16 hours on that fuel, and then we would have an engine failure.
Wow.
And on my 25th mission, I was leading a scouting force mission to Leipzig, Germany, which, by the way, was my first bomber mission also to Leipzig, Germany. And I got halfway across the channel, and when I crossed 14,000 feet and the high blower cut in, the engine quit. And I couldn't get it restarted, and so I called Mayday, and instead of sending me back to England, they vectored me into Belgium. And they were vectoring me to a field, and I had dropped the drop tanks and set up a good glide, and I was going along fine and talking to this guy on the radio, and all of a sudden there was a tremendous explosion. The cowl come off, went right over my head, hit the top of the canopy and shattered the canopy, took the top off of the rudder, and
Was that this canopy that we're seeing here on the picture?
yeah, this is the canopy, and this is the cowl that came off. This whole top of this cowl blew off, went off, hit the top of the canopy, and it took about this much off the top of the rudder. And so I decided I had to bail out, and I told the guy I was bailing out, and he says, "Oh, don't bail out." He says, you only got a couple miles to go. And I said, "I'm burning." He says, "You better bail out." So I decided to do the rollover, but I forgot to wind in down trim. When I rolled over and let go of the stick, the airplane split us into me. I got halfway out of I was hanging over the top of the armor plate like this, and I finally got back into the cockpit and pulled back on the stick, and I pulled out, and then I put up trim in it, and I decided to dive for the trailing edge of the wing, and which was a standard way of bailing out. And I got such big feet that I was wearing GI shoes, and one of the GI shoes caught between the canopy, or I had jettisoned the canopy, and I got caught in a space about that big, between the canopy rollers and the windshield. The sole of my right shoe caught.
Oh, gosh.
And I was hanging by the side of the airplane with flames going by me, and I got my left foot up and pushed it against the windshield, and I tore the sole off of that GI shoe. And I went back, and then I was going down, and I didn't know that I had hit the tail or anything, because in fact my goggles were broken and I had cuts in my face from the glass, and I looked at my right hand and told it to pull the ripcord, and it didn't move. So I tried to get my left fingers under the ripcord, and I couldn't, so I grabbed this wrist, hooked these fingers in the ripcord, pulled like that, the chute popped, and I swung out once, and I hit the ground face down. And I was in Inglemunster, Belgium, and I was dragged across the field up against a fence, and I was rescued, or surrounded by a whole bunch of people in wooden shoes, and the men had big baggy pants on, and the women had hats that turned up on the side, and I thought I was in Holland or something, because it looked like Peter in the dike, you know, the pictures we'd seen of the Dutch kids. And so I was laying there, and then they were trying to help me. They rolled up my parachute and put it under my head, and they said, Tommy is coming. And another one ran up that looked just like the rest, and he bent over me, and he says, how you doing, mate? And I said, where did you come from? And he said, I was a soldier in World War I, and I married a Belgian girl, and I'm a farmer here now. So I said, would you, by that time my arm hurt real bad, and I said, would you get the morphine syringe out of my first aid kit on my parachute? So he said something in Belgian to the people, and they ran over and they pulled the handle on my dinghy, my life raft, and that blew up, and they all ran and hid in the bushes because they thought it was a bomb or something. And they finally found the first aid kit, and they brought it over to me, and I got the morphine syringe out, and I handed it to this guy, and I said, here, would you stick this in my arm? And he says, oh, I couldn't do that, mate. And I said, give it to me, and I shoved it in my leg and squeezed it, and somebody right away said, Red Cross, Red Cross, and a Canadian ambulance drove up. And the guy jumped out of there, and he come over and give me another shot of morphine in the arm. So I had one in the leg and one in the arm. And when I woke up, I was in an aid station in Inglemunster, and the doctor was taking my $50 shirt, and you remember the shirts we used to buy for $50, and he was cutting the sleeve on the shirt, and I said, what are you cutting my shirt for? He said, there's blood coming down your arm. He says, you got a broken arm. And so they took me to a hospital at New Dunkirk, Belgium, and then they flew me out of there in a C-47. By the way, while I was in that hospital in New Dunkirk, we were shelled each night by the Germans that were still hanging out at Dunkirk. They still hadn't completely captured Dunkirk, and they had some flak guns left there, and they would lob shells over at us every night, and they were going off outside the hospital. And
Well, what date was this, Richard?
this is 31st of March, 1945. And then I went back to England, and they put me in the hospital there and worked on me for a while, and then they sent me back to we were then flying, instead of out of Huntington, we had moved to Bassingbourn, which is where the Memphis Belle was filmed, and we had our P-51 there at Bassingbourn. I flew my last 14 missions out of Bassingbourn in the P-51. And I was waiting to get my arm well enough to fly, and it was in the middle of April or the end of April, and it looked like Germany was going to surrender. And my CO, who was Colonel Brooks at that time, said, I'm going to send you back to the States. You're not going to get to fly any more combat because of your arm. So I went to southern England, where the boats all leave from. I can't remember the name of the town now. Anyway, we were waiting to get on the boat when Germany surrendered, and they had a big party. They burned Hitler in effigy and everything. And I got on the Ile de France, and we were the first ship into New York Harbor after VE Day. And you never saw such a celebration in your life. And I got home, I told you I got home on the 25th of May, and I asked my father if I could go ask Betty to marry me. And he says, hell no, you're not 21 yet, and you don't have my permission. Here I had 60 combat missions, the Distinguished Flying Cross, the 7 Air Medals, and the Purple Heart, and I couldn't ask Betty to marry me. He says, son, listen, marriage is something you'll only regret once, and that's the rest of your life. So I waited till the 3rd of June when I was 21, and I went down and I said to her, Betty's father, may I ask Betty to marry me, which we were supposed to do at that time. He said, hell yes, get one of these women out of the house. So on the 16th of June, 1945, we were married. We had 6 sons, no girls. And I spent 10 years in the Air Force. I went back to Master Sergeant in 1947, and I was recalled for the Berlin Airlift and went over on the Berlin Airlift. I was recalled in a grade lower than my reserve grade, and then they, to save money, they took us off of flying status, wouldn't let us fly anymore, to save $110 a month. But then when Korea started, they jumped us right back on flying status, and they gave me orders to go to Korea as a P-51 pilot, and I hadn't flown in a year and a half. And so I got to Luke Field, and they came out with a letter that said, "We're sorry, you can go to Korea in a grade lower than your reserve grade, and we won't be able to promote you because we've recalled too many people from the reserves who had all got political promotions, and some of them were lieutenant colonels already, and they had 400 hours of flying time, and I had 2,500 hours, and they were, they said, if you feel this is unfair, you may apply for discharge under this letter." And I had 3 sons, and I figured they ought to grow up with a father, so I got out.
Good for you.
And I went back to work for Kodak, and they gave me credit for the 10 years I was in the service. So when I retired from Kodak in '82, I had 40 years of service at Kodak. And I came to California and went to work for Fender Guitars for 3 years, and then I went to work for Northrop on the B-2. And I finally retired in '89, and we moved out to Hemet. That's where we live now.
Richard, I'd like to go back. I'm not familiar with it, that your scouting missions with that P-51, what I've read, the Mosquitoes had performed that before, dropping flares at night and things like that.
That wasn't, they were doing target finding and,
Yeah.
Target marking. What we were doing, Bud Peasley was the leader on one of the Bad Schweinfurt missions. He was the commander of, I can't remember what bomb group it was. It was a B-17 group in the same division as a 303rd was. Anyway, he thought that they should have a group of fighters flying out ahead of the bombers to talk to the lead pilots and tell them what the weather was like, what was the best angle to come in so they could get visual bombing of the target, and how the flak was, which way to come in to have the best chance against flak, and also to help guide them back out from the targets after they'd bombed, and to keep them from having such terrible, they had some terrible mid-air collisions in bad weather on missions before that. So he talked Jimmy Doolittle into organizing the scouting forces, and they started in June of '44, and I got into it in October '44, and I flew my first mission on the 14th of December '44 in a P-51. And that whole story is in the thing I gave you. I don't know if you took it or...
Bonnie has it now.
Yeah, Spider story is there, and that tells the whole story of it. And there's some great pictures, and I made one of them up for you to keep.
Thank you.
So, but it was very interesting, and for my age at the time, I was very thrilled at what I was doing. In fact, Betty will tell you, when I come home, I was very nervous for almost a year because I couldn't wind down. I was so wound up from being excited about going on a combat mission every day, and I just, if it hadn't been for the parties we had at the officers club and the singing around the table and the drinking till I was, yes, she's shaking her head. Anyway,
But I didn't.
and we, I had a fabulous career in the Air Force, very exciting.
Do you have some questions yet, Richard, for him?
What?
Don't forget about
Do you have any
Belgium.
more questions?
Oh, yes.
Do you have any more
No.
questions?
Very, very interesting thing that I've got to tell you to kind of end my story is, you know, I told you about being surrounded by these people in wooden shoes and stuff. Well, we were at our bomb group reunion last October in Portland, Oregon, and we were all singing around the table, and I was sitting next to a guy named Polk, and I sing tenor, and he sings high tenor, and we were harmonizing, and his wife was sitting to the left of me, and she was talking to me, and I said, "Are you from France? You have a French accent." She says, "No, I'm from Tielt, Belgium." And I said, "Oh, Tielt, Belgium, that's 12 miles from where I bailed out in 31st of March, 1945. She says, "Where?" And I said, "Inglemunster, Belgium." She says, "My nephew lives there, and they've been looking for that pilot all these years." So she took all my information, she took Betty's and my photograph, and 2 weeks later, I got emails from the people in Belgium. 2 of them were still alive who had helped rescue me. They were my age then, 20 years old at that time. And one of them was a historian in the thing, so in that folder that I have of all the stuff is all the information. And then about a month later, we received the front page of the Ingle-Munster newspaper, and it had Betty's and my picture on it, and the whole story of my bailout was on there, where the airplane has crashed. It's under a building now, but I wanted to go over there and dig up a piece of my airplane because they knew right where it had hit and everything, and I would love to have a piece of Easy Does It, which was the name of my airplane.
While you're back there on that incident, what altitude do you think you were when you finally got shaken
Well, I
loose?
started to bail out at 8,000 feet, but when I went through, you know, having my foot caught in the cockpit, I wasn't reading any instruments then, you know, and hanging and banging against the side of the fuselage with flames going by me. I don't know what altitude I was. I just know that when I finally got the chute open, it popped once and I swung out once and hit the ground face down.
So you're pretty close to the ground.
I was pretty close to the ground. And the wind dragged me across the field up to a fence, and that's when all of these people surrounded me. And the interesting thing is that I've heard from all of them again, and I'm still hearing once in a while. I get an email from them, it's very interesting. And now we're going to Savannah, to the 8th Air Force Museum for our reunion this year. It will be in Savannah in August, the end of August, and I'm looking forward to that. And Betty says that'll be our last one. And, yeah, unless we had one, what, 3 years ago in
The most
San Diego.
exciting one was in England when we went
Oh,
to
yeah.
military bases.
We
where
went,
they honor all
by the
the
way,
US
we
soldiers.
went over to a reunion at Molesworth, our old bomber base, which is still, it's a joint analysis base where they download information from the satellites, and they have Air Force, Navy, and Army, all 3 services, people are there, and they analyze all the information they get from the satellites and send it to SHAPE headquarters and the Pentagon. And they ran a big party for us and put up a big monument at the gate of the base, which isn't an air base anymore, but the 2 hangars still exist. So they had a hangar dance, and which we used to have when I was flying combat. And 2,000 British people bought tickets to come to the hangar dance. There was 174 of us over there at this reunion, and they had a bagpiper with kilts on and everything, and he piped us in, and all the British people stood and saluted us as we marched into the hall. And then they all come over with pictures and asked us to autograph pictures and stuff.
Isn't that great?
And they're the only people in the world that really appreciate what we did for them.
French never.
You walk down the street in England with an 8th Air Force cap on, they come up and throw their arms around you and tell you how much they appreciate what we did for them in World War II. You remember that too. They really are great people. And my wife has an aunt and uncle that live over there, so we rented a car and drove a lot around England, and got to see quite a bit of it. And I got to go back to Honington, and I went to the Duxford Museum, and I met Gunther Rahl at the Duxford Museum and talked to him quite a while. So it was a real exciting experience to go back to a reunion in England.
Gunther Rau was Herr General
Yeah,
Leutnant, chief of the Luftwaffe after the war.
After the war, I know.
Yes. He
I know.
trained in T-33 airplanes and flew the Starfighter,
yeah,
the 104.
yeah.
And you were fortunate to meet him.
Well,
I met him also several years ago at a breakfast in Oceanside. Quite a man.
Very nice guy, and they had brought him there because they had an ME-109 that was flyable there, and they brought him there to look at the ME-109, and I was there with Peter Randall, who does he has a website called Little Friends, and it's about all the American fighter groups in Europe during World War II, and it has a web page for each fighter group. All the ones that want to keep up a web page have a web page on this Little Friends site, and Peter Randall's an Englishman that does this kind of as a hobby. But he had the 3 scouting forces were on this one too. But he was taking me through Duxford. I met him at Duxford and we had breakfast, and then we were going through the museum, and somebody ran in and said, Gunther Rahl's outside and he wants to meet you. So we went outside, and Betty was with me, and we talked to Gunther Rahl, and he was a very nice guy.
He had 302 victories.
Yes.
Wow. Yeah, they flew several missions a day, those boys.
Yeah, I know it. Nobody ever finished 35 missions or 25 missions in the Luftwaffe. They flew till they died.
That's right.
I hate to cover up the P-51 with this.
Any more combat experiences or any wartime experiences that you...
Well, I was coming back from a mission in the P-51, and we saw some 263s landing, and I got in the pattern behind one of them and fired at them. But they gave me a probable on a 263, which was a jet.
Was
but I
that it?
don't think I got him because he poured the coal to it, and the smoke come out of the back, and they said, oh, you hit him because of that smoke, but that was from his engines, I think. So I don't think I got him. We have the scouting force, every year they run their last reunion again, and we're only down to 4 or 5 guys left. General Allison Brooks, I don't know if you ever met him, he was in Air Sea Rescue and stuff. When they were doing the first space missions, when they landed out in the Pacific, he was the general in command of the Air Sea Rescue stuff then. But he was the commander of the scouting force after Bud Peasley had gone back to the States. He's still alive, and but every year another one goes, or another couple go, and we didn't have too many. That whole organization, I don't think, had over 30 people in it in the whole, from June of 44 until May of 45. They just didn't have that many people in it, because our missions were usually 4 ex-bomber pilots escorted by 4 fighter pilots, and it was. But I did some missions during I flew a couple missions ground strafing during the Battle of the Bulge to help the troops, and they weren't really scouting missions, but they wanted all the fighters they could get over there, and that's some of the couple times. I flew 10 missions before I ever went to gunnery training.
Did you?
And I have a very interesting story about that. I was sent up to the Wash. You know where the Wash was in England? It's a big bay up north of Norwich, and they had a target that you could go out and shoot at in the bay, and I went up and fired the guns, and I fired all my ammunition from the P-51 and turned off the switch, and all of a sudden I got bounced by a Spitfire. And so I said, well, that's smart ass, I'll show him. And I dropped 10 degrees of flaps and broke the wire and went through to 91 inches of mercury and stood it on his tail, and I was going up, I thought like this, I looked out this side and he was gone. I said, oh boy, I got him. And I looked out this side, and there he was flying my wing on the inside. He had a great big handlebar mustache and a big grin on his face, and he waves at me like this. And he said, come on, follow him. So I followed him back to his base, and he was a wing commander. I don't know what it was equal to a general in the RAF, and he had been an ace in the Battle of Britain. And he brought me back to his base, and he said, I've always wanted to fly a P-51. He said, would you check me out in a P-51, and I'll check you out in a Spitfire. So I got to fly a Spitfire, and I got him Now, I would've got court-martialed by Colonel Brooks if he knew I let a Limey fly my P-51, but I did, I let him fly my P-51. And I stayed that night and sang at the bar and learned a lot of British songs and
That's very interesting.
a lot of fun.
Any more incidents like that?
No, that's about it, I guess. I talked enough, my wife is telling me to shut up.
Well, we got 10 minutes left on this tape, and I've got another 60 minutes we can put in. What did you do at Kodak after you?
Well, I come back and on the GI Bill, I went and got a degree in manufacturing engineering at Rochester Institute of Technology, and I worked. I started working as a tool maker, but then I got into manufacturing engineering at Kodak Park where they made film, and we worked on making machines to make film, and also machines that went into stores for developing film and stuff. We made some of the first ones, what they call processing machines, and then I was a model airplane enthusiast, and I helped found a radio control club in Rochester, New York, and one of my guys that was in the radio control club was a manager of manufacturing engineering at what was CameraWorks at Kodak. And he said, "What are they doing with you now?" And I said, "Well, I still work in the same place, but I do some engineering on the side." He said, "They're not treating you right after getting your degree." He said, "I'm going to see if I can get you transferred." So he got me transferred to CameraWorks, and I got into automation design. We designed automatic machines for putting cameras together. They called the machine the code assembler. And because I was in radio control and I used to build my own radios, I got into developing the control system for it. And I helped design all the circuit cards and everything that we had in the controller that controlled the automatic machinery that put cameras together. And I had 9 patents at Kodak. And then in '82, my arm was bothering me, and I had to have an operation because these 3 fingers were going numb, and the ulnar nerve was trapped in where my arm was broken. So the VA wouldn't do anything about it, and so I went to Kodak, and they sent me in. I got it operated on, and they moved the nerve, but I was recovering from that in February of '82, and my son was working for Fender Guitars in California. And he said, "Dad, we're having trouble with our factory. Could you come out to California and visit and write a manufacturing engineering study on the thing?" So I came to California, and CBS owned Fender at the time. And I went around the factory and I wrote up all of the things that I thought was wrong with the factory and what needed to be done to correct them. And in April, after I came back to Rochester, in April I got a call from the CEO of CBS in New York. Can't remember what his name was now, but he was a very famous guy. And he said, "I read your manufacturing engineering report," and he said, "Could you retire from Kodak?" And I said, "Well, I would like to get 40 years in, which I'll have in June." He says, "That's a good idea." He says, "Get your 40 years in." But he says, "We'll offer you $20,000 a year more than you're making in Kodak." I said, "You didn't even ask me what I'm making." He says, "That doesn't make any difference. We'll give you $20,000 more than you're making at Kodak. If you can't sell your house, we'll buy your house and we'll pay your way to California and help you find a house out there." So I took him up on it and retired from Kodak and came out and worked for 3 years for Fender. I had 2 patents at Fender then. And then they called me in and said, "We're going to sell the business." CBS was going to sell the business, and we'd like you to go with it. And I said, "Where are you going to sell it to?" And they said, "Grand Rapids, Michigan." And I said, "No thanks, I never want to shovel snow again." And they said, "Well, that's all right, we'll help you find a job." Because I was only, I think, I was about 60 then, or 61. So they hired somebody to do my resume, and they sent me to a job fair at Disneyland Hotel, and I got hired by Northrop on the B-2, and I worked for 5 years for Northrop on the B-2 as a manufacturing engineer, and I had 2 patents there.
Well, that's wonderful.
So, and I got $1 for each of those patents.
$1.
That's what they give you when you're an engineer working for a company. It's your job to design stuff. So when you get a patent, they buy it from you for $1. They give a whole official thing and give you $1 for your patent. So, but I had very interesting career.
Well, you certainly have. Richard, any more questions?
No, that's quite an outstanding story.
Well, I guess so. We're glad you moved to Hammett and glad you came over here and offered some of your experiences
Well,
to the
I go
museum
to the
here.
March Museum, and I've been asked to be a docent there, but, you know, I don't like driving back and forth. I said I'll go over and help you once in a while if I can, but I don't want to be, I'm too busy flying radio control, you know. And we have a glider club also in Hammett, and I was the president of that, one of the founders of that, and I built the winches, and we have a golf cart with a winch built on the back of it and a retriever that brings the line back so we don't have to go out and get the line every time. We have a turnaround pulley that's 1,000 feet down the field, and we have a couple thousand feet of nylon line, and we have a drum with all the line on it and a starter motor. And we step on the button and you put a hook on the bottom of the airplane and it pulls you up, and when you get to the top of the line you let go of the switch and you fly off of the hook, and
How much altitude do they give you?
you get about 900 feet or so.
And you can go from there?
From there you fly around and look for thermals,
Yeah.
which is rising currents of air, and
Yeah,
I've gotten a 2-hour thermal flight.
I've got a glider rating at back home. They have to pull us up to 4,000 feet.
Oh, yeah. Well, we have quite a glider outfit over there in Hemet, you know. There's 2 brothers, they're German, Aruz their name is, and they owned a glider company over there.
Well, that's why you wanted this glider that's out here.
Yeah. Yeah, I got 4 or 5 of them, but that's the kind I like there. Somebody give you that?
It was here when I came. I don't know where it came from.
Gee, if you're not gonna use it, I'll take it.
Back home in the Young Eagles program, they're starting them out with 8 to 10 hours of glider work before they ever get into a powered airplane.
Well, that's a very, very good way to learn.
You bet.
You learn all the feel.
Yeah.
And, but you know, I got a P-51 radio control model that has a retractable landing gear, and it goes about 200 miles an hour, and it'll do everything, rolls and snap rolls. I do loops with snap rolls on the top.
Gee.
And I have mostly scale models. I got a big giant scale Cub that's a 100-inch wing spread. It has floats on it, and I fly that off the water. But we have a lot of fun with radio control. It gives me a chance to do it standing on the ground. Don't risk anything.
Well, Spider, we are indeed fortunate to have you with us today.
I
We
enjoy
thank you
coming.
and we congratulate you on your past experiences.
I had a lot
You
of fun.
are an outstanding man.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And I want to extend that thank you, and also to Richard Zuber here that helped me conduct this interview.
I want to thank Richard too. It was good meeting him, and I told somebody downstairs that by the B-17 there where you got the food place, up above you got a bunch of RC airplanes. One of them is the Rumpler-Taube, which was a World War I German airplane. It's got the funny shaped wings, and Jack DeVries, who was a colonel, retired colonel in the Air Force, he and I went to high school together. He lives in Colorado Springs, but he wrote a book about the Rumpler-Taube called The Taube, the Dove of War. And that book, it might be available. His email is oldtiger@AOL.com. You might be able to get in touch with him and see if you can get a copy of that book for your library, because you have an interesting model of the airplane there, and it's World War I airplane. And he was in Shape headquarters, and he got to go to the factory where they built that airplane, and he wrote this whole story on the design and the building of that airplane in World War I.
Well, again, I want to thank you, and I want to apologize for the mix-up this morning.
That's all right.
With too
We
many
had fun.
Richard Smiths for
Well,
our organization.
Ask Betty how it is to have to, what kind of a name do you have to give when you get your drugs? She has to,
I have to have a Liz,
Elizabeth Jane Smith, she has to put on the,
oh, everything, yeah.
she has to give her whole name, or they get her all mixed up with the wrong